friends. Welcome to Worldbuild with Us, the podcast where we create fantastical worlds, normally with help from you, our listeners. But on today's very special episode, we have an interview with RPG industry luminary, Pathfinder, Starfinder co-creator, rock god, James L. Sutter. And in our interview, we kind of go over a little bit of world building stuff, have a lot of fun, kind of get to pick his brain about what it's like to be in the industry. And then towards the end, we actually get to do a world building jam session. And of course, we're doing this interview with xenogenic xenophobe, Chris Prunty.
I'm a xenophile.
As well as our special guest, Daniel Quinn. We're just going to go ahead and cut straight to the interview now, and we'll see you on the other side.
He's metal, guys.
He is very metal. All right, and we are here with James L. Sutter. James, welcome to the podcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today. Why don't you go ahead and just start off by telling us about yourself a little bit?
Okay. Well, like you said, my name is James Sutter. I'm probably best known as the co-creator of the Pathfinder and Starfinder role-playing games. Before that, I started out in the role-playing game industry working as an editor and developer on Dungeon Magazine for Dungeons & Dragons. And then we moved on and created Pathfinder, and then I did a bunch of different jobs related to the Pathfinder world, working as a developer, an editor, a writer, all those different things. I was the executive editor in charge of the novel line for Pathfinder, and then I was the original creative director on Starfinder, sort of helping to kind of create that world, which actually was a really fun project because we got to base the Starfinder setting in large part on a book I'd written about Pathfinder's solar system called Distant Worlds. And so Starfinder gave us a chance to expand out from there, and I got to lead that team, which was really fun. And then I stepped down from that a couple years ago to go to writing full time. And so in addition to my day job stuff, I've also written comics and video games, and I've got 2 novels, Death's Heretic and The Redemption Engine, both of which are kind of like Blade Runner meets Dante's Inferno. They're both set in the Pathfinder world, but they're all about an atheist detective who, through some bad decisions, ends up tracking down souls for the death goddess. So yeah, I've done a bunch of different stuff, been on kind of all different sides of the RPG and fiction industries.
I've been a big fan of Paizo and Pathfinder and Starfinder for a number of years. I've been following kind of that whole crew since Dungeon Era magazine.
Nice.
Yeah, that's basically when I started getting into RPGs, was through the magazines, really. And, your settings and books and everything like that are kind of what drew me in. I remember the first adventure path and just being blown away at how well designed and how intricate everything was. It was a really interesting and awesome, it was a fun experience to kind of understand that that's what you could do with an RPG.
Thank you. So when you say first adventure path, do you mean the first Paizo one, Rise of the Rune Lords, or the first Pathfinder one, or do you mean the adventure paths in Dungeon Magazine?
Oh, I'm talking about Dungeon Magazine back.
Back with Shackled City. And Age of Worms was. That was
Shackled City was with Cauldron, which is where where it really started for me, where I fell in love and oh wow, I can do so much with this. It's great. And, that obviously introduced me to a lot of the great writers like James Jacobs or Richard Pett. Yeah. And you, obviously, I've read both your novels. Yeah.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah.
That's really exciting, actually.
Yeah, and I was going to say, there's a definite, noir feel to both your novels. And it's interesting. I was rereading parts of it. And Death's Heretic is fairly straightforward, all things considered, until you get and then Redemption Engine is okay, now that this is established, let's get into the really fun stuff, and that's really what I pulled away from that.
Right. Well, and both of those books were very much written, the express goal for me was which parts of the world am I super excited to play with, and how can I craft a book that will allow me to go to as many of these different locations and see as many of these different critters as I can, so Death's Heretic, there's a bunch of outer planar stuff because it's like, man, wouldn't it be fun to write a book that goes to, the Maelstrom and the First World and all of these different planes that I'm
Oh yeah.
super in love with. I've always been a fan of outer planes, back from the Planescape days and before. And then the Redemption Engine was a chance for me to go play in Kermaga, which was a city that I built for Pathfinder, which was, everybody kind of worked on everything on the team, but everybody also had certain areas that were sort of their pet projects. And so I got to create Kermaga pretty much from scratch over the course of many years and be the primary person doing almost all the design work for it. And so it really was a treat to get to go back then and write a whole novel set there.
I mean, absolutely. I remember reading the first bit about Karamaga, just being like, "What is a bloat mage? And what
Right?
are wormful?" Yeah, exactly. And I remember reading an article that you followed up with. Like, I also had no idea what was going on around
Yeah,
that
yeah.
time too. So it was kind of like a challenge to yourself to kind of fill in, what you had. You just came up with the most evocative phrases and be like, "Okay, now I got to actually do it."
Well, and
You know.
that's actually one of my favorite ways to world build, and it's something that a lot of people at Paizo, had really embraced that idea of don't try and do everything at once. Like
Mm-hmm.
start small, leave yourself some breadcrumbs and some things that excite you, and then if you're excited about a thing and the audience is excited about a thing, you can explore it more and more. So actually, the way Karamaga evolved is a perfect example of that because it started out so one of the very first adventure modules we published, I can't remember if the magazines were already over at that point, but one of the first modules that Paizo published kind of on its own was this module called Seven Swords of Sin, that had actually started as sort of an in-office contest to design all these deadly dungeon rooms. And then we said, this is pretty fun. And Sutter, why don't you take this and try and like stitch it all together and add a bunch of new stuff and make it into a proper dungeon crawl adventure. And so I did that, but in order to have this dungeon, I needed to create some sort of location for the dungeon to be set in. And so I was kind of, I was big into like China Mieville's stuff at the time, Perdido Street Station and stuff. And I was kind of going that way. And then Eric said, hey, Sutter, I need you to build us a Castle Greyhawk. We need a location that you can just have infinite dungeon adventures underneath. I kind of went, well, that's not a
No
tall
big
order
deal.
at all.
Yeah,
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 exactly.
yeah.
Design for us one of the most iconic locations, in analog. But so I sort of smashed up those ideas, and so really there wasn't much space for that setting. So it was like you said, it was like a half a page in the back of the module where I just wrote whatever random stuff came to mind that sounded intriguing about this city that was full of, bloat mages who use the power of the magic in their own blood to cast magic, and sweet talkers who sew their own lips shut, and just all of these different things. The worm folk and
The
uh,
Irish trolls are one of my favorites as well. I've
oh
definitely
yeah, yeah,
filled in that for
the
sure.
augurs,
Yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
And so I just sort of threw this stuff out there. And then it was really the audience coming back onto the message boards and saying, well, what is all this stuff? Like, what's a worm folk? What's a bloat mage? And so then I got to write a short story set there in the third Pathfinder volume. And in that one, I also included some little sidebars on the different districts of the city and sort of explaining, okay, what is a bloat mage? Coming up with these ideas.
Mhm.
And then people loved it, and so then that became the impetus to do a 64-page campaign setting book where we just detailed the city as a whole, and that was really fun. That was one of my favorite early projects, and still remains one of my favorite world building projects actually, because it let me just really deep dive on that city. And then from there, I got to set a novel there, and so it just kept sort of expanding over the course of, God, possibly a decade.
Wow.
And it's really fun to be able to build like that over time. Like obviously, not everything takes that form. Sometimes you need to build stuff a little bit faster. But
So I have a question for you, considering that you have like more than a decade, doing both novel writing and world building for RPGs.
yeah.
Like, what do you see as the differences when you're putting together like a supplement for an RPG and you're doing the world building for a novel? Like, where is the overlap and where are the differences? 'Cause I feel like a lot of our listeners, they're coming at this either from an RPG angle or they're trying to write, and so they want to figure out how they can use world building in both cases.
Well, I mean, the first thing I'd say is that a lot of it is the same. I teach world building classes every so often, both online and in person. And what I tell people is like it's mostly the same toolbox. You're using the same ideas, the same strategies to ask yourself questions that can then lead you to create these interesting worlds. I'd say the biggest difference between the two approaches. Is just thinking about the utility of them and like what they're going to be used for. So if you're writing a novel, you only really need to build the parts of the world that your story is going to touch, and you get to decide those things. And so while you can absolutely write a giant world document and then use that to inspire your storytelling, you can also just say like, look, if I know that this story is going to take place entirely in country A, then I really only need to know a tiny amount about countries B, C, and D, like just enough to drop some illusions and make the world feel larger, right? Whereas if I'm doing it as an RPG, I don't necessarily know where people are going to want to spend their time and energy, so I need to take into account the fact that players might want to zig instead of zag. And also, I think really, so my strategy when designing an RPG setting, especially a gazetteer, is to remember that your job isn't to detail everything, it's to inspire the game master. And so it's often more important to ask interesting questions than to give the answers. And so one of the ways that I keep that in mind is when I'm writing a gazetteer of, here's 30 different locations in this nation or whatever. I really try to make sure that I've got a solid adventure hook, like every 100 words. Every location you write about should have something in it that makes a game master sit up and go, "Oh, I could design an entire adventure or an entire campaign launching off of this one detail." And if you ever have a detail like a location that doesn't have something like that, and it doesn't have to just be locations. It can also be if you're talking about, guilds or religions or whatever. If you don't have a really obvious story hook in whatever you're describing, you should really go back and look at it again, because especially as a professional, as somebody who's trying to sell stuff, the only reason people are coming to your work is because they want to be inspired, right, into the games that they're going to play. And so that's where I get frustrated sometimes with, people think that more information is better. And so you'll end up with, some inn that has 10 pages written on it and it's got every, drink and menu item detailed. So you've got this huge amount of verisimilitude, but there's no adventure there. There's
No
nothing
mystery.
nothing exciting about it. And so even if all you need is just an inn, like this is just designed for the players to stop in, sleep there, get a drink, whatever. Like put something in there, give the bartender a shady past that could come back to haunt her at any moment, have there be a ghost in the attic, have there be something going on.
Put a
so
weird
that
trophy on the wall kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Something for the players or the GM to latch onto. Because otherwise, if you're just detailing a generic inn, well, whoever is buying your book could have done that themselves, right? Like,
And if you're doing it for players, why would they want to go back to that inn again? I mean, by creating these interesting and unique aspects to the inn itself, you're also giving yourself as a GM less work to do because, they're just going to go back to that inn that they like. I don't have to create a brand new inn. Like it's essentially adding. I don't know.
And people can ask. It's just like, is there a drink like vodka? And you can be like, yeah, there is. All right, it's called this now.
And there's also hypnotic worm in it that you just ignore that. It's fine. Like stuff like that.
Well, and with both gaming and stories, like the goal is to capture the person's imagination. It's not necessarily to tell them even, to give them the answers, but I can't tell you how many interactions I've had with people where I, write something in a book that's 2 sentences about the lost city of whatever that's hanging from the cliffs, just over the horizon. And then I'll run into somebody at a convention and they'll say, "Oh my God, I love your work. We've been playing in that city for like the last 2 years, this whole campaign." And they're saying, "Oh, you did so well with that." And I'm thinking, I wrote 2 sentences. Half the time I don't even remember the location you're talking about.
It's all about the hook. Yeah.
Yeah, because it was enough to make you ask the questions, and by asking the questions, you then answered them for yourself in interesting ways. And that's how I work with myself as well. All of my world building strategies are based on trying to ask questions so that I have no choice but to answer them in ways I didn't expect.
Are you a pantser or are you a plotter when it comes to your novels?
Do you want to give people
Take
a
a step
definition of
back.
that?
Oh yeah, sure. So the pantsers are the kind that just like put the page down, they start writing. They don't have a real plan in mind. The plotters have pages and pages of detailed notes where their plot's going.
Yeah, so I'm definitely a plotter, and that's a result of my training, kind of in both the magazine and then the book industry. Because I'm I'm a very lazy mercenary sort of writer, and so I don't want to write things more than I have to. And so by having a really solid outline at the beginning, I can write a thing once, and then go back and edit it, of course. But I don't have to risk getting halfway through a novel and then realizing that everything needs to change and going back to the start, right? I always say I want to write a book as few times as possible, right? But that said, I will also say that writing the outline is my least favorite part of every project. Like, I think it's absolutely the hardest part. That week when I'm figuring out what's needs to happen in the book is so much harder than the 6 months when I'm actually writing it.
It's because you're in the outlining process. You're trying to answer these questions instead of raise them, which is the fun part, the raising of the questions, right?
Yeah. Well, and for me, there's a terror to the blank page, right? Like, it's so easy to to make quote unquote the wrong choice, right? If there's no right choice and there's no wrong choice, like anything could be the wrong choice. And so I get really intimidated, which is one of the reasons why for my world building, it's usually a matter of just throwing out, it's kind of like stream of consciousness, just throwing out anything I can think of in the hopes that there will be something in there that I can latch on to that'll make me ask a question. And then just it's riffing, it's jamming. That's the only way I know how to build stuff.
Yeah, I really couldn't agree more with you in that. Like, we've been essentially creating our own fantasy setting over the last 25 episodes. And that's the really fun part for us, is where we sit down, and some of my favorite episodes are the episodes where we come in, we have like a blank page or like one sentence, and then we just build from there. And some of the best ideas that we've come up with are just like, okay, I love that idea, let's build on it. And when you talk about jam session, I mean, like, yeah, that's essentially what happens, where you start with a core idea and then everyone gets involved, and it just becomes this, beautiful mosaic after a while, which is pretentious but also accurate because everyone's involved in it.
Yeah, we'll get to a point where it's just like, oh, I like X, Y, and Z, but I don't really know how to what it's missing. And then one of you will usually chime in and be like, just like, what if it had this?
Or you'll ask a question, and then that'll get your brain thinking about it, and then of course you go back. And I imagine, James, that for you probably experienced a bit of that at Paizo, but I imagine it's probably much different when you're alone and trying to do that, for your own writing.
Right. Yeah. In a lot of ways, it can be harder to do it on your own versus, when you're on a team. I really like the ability to, not just riff off other people's ideas, but in the act of explaining an idea to somebody, you can kind of watch their faces and see their reactions and know when you've hit gold and when they're getting a little bit bored. And so you can change things up on the fly. But my 2 principles that I generally try and start out any world building class with are evolution and intersection. And so what I mean by that is, the intersection is trying to have multiple ideas that come together in interesting ways. Like instead of just taking one trope, and saying like, okay, well, I like dragons, so I'm just going to do dragons. You say, well, take two different tropes that are unrelated and mash them up and say, well, I really like dragons and I really like zombies. How can I mash those up? Oh, look, you've got Game of Thrones, right? And so I think that often the really interesting world building details will come from smashing up two things and asking, well, how do these intersect? And they'll usually, kind of like billiard balls, send you off in a third direction that you didn't really expect, where you're saying, well, how does that work? Like, why would these things make sense together? And evolution is also kind of about that. It's about sort of explaining why things are the way they are, whether that's retconning from an idea that you have or taking sort of a situation and expanding outward from it. And so asking yourself, like, okay, well, if you're going to have a flying city, like that's cool, but why is the city flying? Mm-hmm. What are the environmental factors that led to that? Like, is the ground poisonous? Or is it a political thing? They're trying to avoid, touching down in any particular nation because then the nation has sovereignty. Is it?
That's Bioshock, yeah.
Yeah, right. Like, so just asking yourself all of those questions about how things got to be the way they are and where they're going, it can be really fruitful.
I really couldn't agree more. Like the evolution is kind of the process in a lot of ways, understanding how and why everything fits. And I think one of the things that I'm really big on with my own world building is, does it make sense? And if not, how can I make it make sense?
Yes,
cohesion is so important, because once you lose that verisimilitude, it's like, okay, you've lost the players in a lot of ways.
Well, and that retconning, I've always said I love retconning, actually, because I feel like it can add a lot of verisimilitude. Like, here's a classic example I give from Pathfinder is when we were in the early days of Pathfinder, we had this big old world map and we were just trying to populate it as quickly as possible with locations, and everybody's throwing names on there. And in that sort of fast and furious environment, you're going to make a few mistakes. And so there's stuff like, we ended up with two different orc cities that had almost the same name. One was Urgir and one was Urglin, and they weren't even that far from each other. And we kind of looked at that and went, oh no, like we look like idiots. And then I said, like, no, wait, how about this? How about this is an orc language thing? And, is their name for is their word for city or home, and so Urgir is first home and Urglin is second home, and now there's this like linguistic thing that connects them. Or we had the same thing happen we had two different nations whose capitals were Elidir and Elidare, which are like the one letter difference, and we went, oh, I mean, this isn't just a screw up. Like, they're the same capital, like they're capitals of these nations. But then we realized one of those nations is a colony. And we said, oh, well, this is perfect, actually. It's settlers from Elidir founded Elidare. And, in the same way that you've got York and New York, there's all sorts of cities in the States that have European names. So actually, this makes the world feel more real. That kind of thing. I love figuring out how seeming mistakes actually make sense.
Yeah, I think Bob Ross calls those happy little accidents.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly.
I think what we've done, because, as we're creating the setting, we're kind of figuring stuff out. We've just stopped calling it retconning at this point. We're just calling them patch notes.
Like patch for software, right?
Yeah, it's like we're just adding stuff and changing it. Hey, like bug report, this continent no longer exists because it doesn't fit anymore.
So, it was a legend. It was a legend, damn it.
There you go.
Well, and so much of it comes down to the the old improv principle of yes and, right? Like, you want to keep the scene going by saying, like, okay, everything we've told you is true. Now I'm going to tell you something else that's true that adds a whole new dimension to it, right?
Do you have any moments in the writer's room, like at Paizo or at Dungeon, wherever you were working at the time, that stick out to you as like those kind of aha moments when you guys figured something out that was really tough?
Oh God. I mean, there's a million of them, so I'm trying to grab like. Actually, the first thing I think of is one of my first real contributions to Dungeon Magazine was I remember when we were doing I think the Savage Tide adventure path, and I hadn't been like I'd been editing it for a while, but I hadn't really been in on the ground stage planning of Age of Worms. So this was my first chance to kind of like be there at the start. And I remember we were trying to figure out what the motivation for Demogorgon, the big bad guy, was. And I remember at some point, because he's got two heads, and at some point everybody was going round and round trying to figure out like, why is he doing this? Why is he doing these things that don't make sense? And I, raised my hand and was like, what if the two heads are arguing with each other?
Like, what if they're working, other? That's hilarious.
Yeah, it's working against each other. And I remember Jacobs, just lighting up. And one thing about, so James Jacobs, who's the creative director for Pathfinder, and is one of the most creative guys in the business. So something I used to love about working for him originally, because he started out as my boss, and then working with him, is when you get a good idea, like when you can light him up, he just explodes with laughter. And it's just like, it's this delightful thing where instantly that you've won the game. And so much of the early years was just, if I can get Jacobs excited about an idea, it's good. Right. And so that was so much of the early days of Dungeon, especially when I was first getting my feet underneath me. Because when I came into working in RPGs, I told people I spent the first couple of years just learning what was cool. Like, because I had some tastes. I knew the books that I liked, but I just didn't know what really made a great RPG. And so I spent a lot of time listening to, Jacobs and Eric Mona, the publisher, and Wes Schneider and Jason Bullman, and just sort of figuring out what all of their tastes were and watching how they interacted with each other and sort of picking and choosing the things that I really liked and figuring out how you synthesize a group of really diverse tastes into a world that, Pathfinder, a lot of people when we started it said it was a terrible idea because the conventional idea was you can't build a world that's everything to everybody. Like, you need to go in really strong on a particular flavor, because if you look at the old second edition Dungeons and Dragons things, like, Dark Sun had a very specific flavor. Planescape had a very specific flavor. Birthright, Dragonlance. They really would like pick something and do a deep dive. And so the idea was, if you try and make a game, a setting where anybody can play anything they want, it'll just be generic and nobody will be excited about it. And what we discovered is like, while there is that danger, by making a world that had very specific regions, so you had like Ustalov was your sort of Transylvania, Ravenloft, Gothic horror land, right?
That's Wes Schneider's baby, isn't it?
Yeah. Wes Schneider was very much the architect of that, right? And so, like, you could play, if that was what you liked, you could play in the Pathfinder setting and just play there. And you would never even know that there's, there's Viking land over here, and there's magical guns over here, and there's the undead nation over there, right? Like, we really tried to make sure that you could play any sort of game you wanted within the same setting, but that we would sort of contain them all so that you didn't necessarily have everything leaking into each other. So if you wanted to play, a really hardcore Arabian Nights game and somebody else wanted to play a Conan versus Aliens game, like, those two didn't have to interrupt each other. But also, for somebody like me who's really, I get bored very easily in games. And so I love it when every adventure has a different flavor, is going to a new location. And it's something that if people play through any of the adventures I've written, you'll find there's often several very different flavors in the same, in even the same adventure, not even the same campaign, just because I really like to mix things up and keep players on their toes.
So going back, I think a number of years, there was a tweet of you where you were criticizing New Orleans and how it was laid out.
Yeah.
as far as the pet peeves and everything, I was reading those and just going over what you would hate about city, like someone giving you a draft of a city and everything. Is there anything for like world building that you would be like, oh God, what are you doing?
Well, actually, first off, I should tell people like the New Orleans thing was fascinating because it was one of those jokes that's sort of not a joke, but so basically what I did is I on Twitter went through the actual map of New Orleans taken from Google Maps, and just pointed out all of these things that feel totally unrealistic and would violate all of these sort of, rules of thumb that I have about designing cities. But of course, like the thing that I think a lot of people didn't get is like, the reason it's a joke is because I'm saying all of these things are fake and unrealistic, but they're real.
Yeah.
Right? Like New Orleans is a bizarre city. You've got all of these things that don't make sense except through the historical context, right? Where you've got, parts of the city that are lower than the river next to them, or you've got a bridge going straight across the widest part of the lake where it would be the hardest to build. And you go, nobody would do that. That doesn't make any sense. But of course it does.
That avoids lakes, rivers, and everything else to snake its way to the ocean.
Yeah. There's all these things. And there were funny things, like canals that look like somebody just, accidentally drew a line there, that kind of thing. And so I was making fun of it, but there are, sort of the message there was like, there are good rules of thumb for designing cities, but also any rule can be broken if you have, an explanation for it. And so, yeah, when that blew up, I actually ended up on television in a New Orleans affiliate, which I did not expect at all. That they wanted to do an interview, and I was like, okay.
Was it friendly, or were they like, apologize?
Well, so when I agreed to go on it, they were like, don't worry, it's fun. It's a fun morning show. Like it'll be really, it'll be very chill. Everybody gets it's all in good fun. And so I exactly. And as soon as they're like, you're live, the host turns to me and goes, so I hear you're talking smack about New Orleans. And I was like, oh, it was a joke. But,
that's when you double down.
Yeah, exactly. Your city is not real. It does not exist.
You just go harder.
Yeah, I'm a New Orleans truther. No,
love it.
But oh God! So now I totally forget the original question. But
I was wondering if you had any that were pet peeves
about world building in general. Yeah. Well, it's easy to talk about map stuff, right? People, you don't need to be a geologist to do sort of some basic research and think about like, okay, like water flows downhill, like you can't have a river that, goes from one ocean to the other ocean. Like that's not a river anymore. Or, rivers that cross all these mountain ranges, thinking about just where you put things, the fact that, mountains are created, by natural forces. And so I often, when I'm drawing a map, try to think about sort of the tectonic plates and the fact that mountains go in ranges, or are caused by, volcanic activity, something like that. It's not just, I'd say one of my pet peeves. Yeah, one of my pet peeves is when people just take a handful of mountains and a handful of forests and lakes and they just scatter them across the map, sort of randomized. Again, anything is possible, and certainly you can, if you have a reason for why it's that way, you can explain it and say, well, this world doesn't have any tectonic activity or whatever. But putting a little thought into why things are the way they are is always worthwhile. So that's true for geography. For world building in general, honestly, I think my biggest pet peeve is just people not bothering to think about why it's interesting. Like what it is that the player, the reader is going to get out of it. Like, don't just make another Middle Earth clone, find something about that world that's novel or that intrigues you and double down on it. You don't need to have the standard elves and dwarves. You don't need
Thank you.
everything
Thank you.
to.
Yeah, I think that's our
Yeah.
pet peeve collectively.
Yeah. Oh, I have such a problem
Yeah.
with elves and dwarves
That
in
is
general.
some of our
they're
pet
the
peeves,
worst.
Because it's,
not all
I
of
feel
us.
like it's such a cultural shorthand.
Except for
You could be
Chris, he
doing
likes
so much
dwarves.
more interesting things. Sorry, we're talking over each other.
Right.
Yeah.
No, I mean it's totally true, and that's one of those things where I can remember being 20, 21 and reading Perdido Street Station for the first time,
Yeah.
and I feel like a combination of reading some of that new weird stuff, and also frankly seeing some adventures like you mentioned Richard Pett earlier.
Yeah.
But as an author who's just totally gonzo in his world building for role-playing games, some of the most iconic adventures that both Dungeon Magazine and Pathfinder ever published came out of Rich. And I think a lot of it was because it went so far afield from the standard elf forests and dwarves under the mountains kind of feel. So yeah, I really encourage people to get weird with their stuff, and even it doesn't have to be everything. Like it's not that you have to totally reinvent the wheel, but just come up with a different take on something and lean into it, right? Like take something that you've always seen be a certain way and rotate it 90 degrees or flip it entirely. If the elves were the good guys before, they're the bad guys now, whatever it is, it doesn't have to be rocket science. But as you change things, it'll force you to get away from like all your other stock sort of stereotypes that you have in your head. Because that's the real danger, is that you'll just end up recycling everything you've already seen, and by tweaking a couple of things, you can make it harder for yourself to just take the easy route.
So in Starfinder, I believe you played a big role in coming up with everything that was done for the sun, and you said it was kind of referencing Sundiver.
Oh yeah, I mean, so I actually, for people who don't know, around Starfinder, like I was really lucky with early-ish on in the creation of Pathfinder's setting. I had always been, even though a lot of people there like science fiction, I'd been the guy who was trying to get sort of science fiction elements into Pathfinder from the beginning. Like in the very first Gazetteer of Varissia that I wrote in Pathfinder number 3, I had a space elevator in there. I was, and Jacobs and Wes actually had to sit me down and go, okay, this is cool, but this is a fantasy game, so you need to slow your roll, right?
And then they add in the elves, and they're just literally space aliens later on, I'm pretty sure.
Right. Well, I mean, that's the thing, is like we rolled some of that stuff out as we went. And actually, elves as aliens is a perfect example of how you can take something familiar and tweak it just a little bit, and then have a lot of fun with it.
It's like the dying Earth direction.
Yeah. Well, and so a few years later, I really wanted to do a book about Galarian's solar system. So if Pathfinder is all set pretty much on this one planet, we know it has a solar system. What are on those other planets? And so, the other Pathfinder staffers very graciously let me just kind of go off and write a book. And so I wrote this book creating the other worlds in the setting. And there were a few things we knew. Like we knew there was going to be a red and green planet very inspired by the pulps, because Eric Mona is a huge pulp fan. And we knew that there was like a Lovecraftian world called Octurne. But most of the planets we didn't, other than that, we didn't really know anything else about the solar system. And so for me, it was a really fun chance to take a bunch of sort of real world astronomical phenomena and see how they would map onto a fantasy setting. And so it's like, okay, well, I've got a world that's tidally locked. So one side is always, facing the sun and one side's always facing away. What does a civilization on that planet look like? If I've got a planet that has a really eccentric orbit, so sometimes it's closer or farther from the sun, what does that look like? And to sort of use those ideas to inspire a bunch of different worlds. And fortunately, it came out and people were very happy with it. And then when it came time to do Starfinder, they let me sort of make that the basis for the Starfinder setting. The sun very much in the original Distant Worlds, the sun was, I had 2 extra pages to fill, but I didn't really have a big concept of what would be going on with the sun. But there was a very, I haven't read it in years, but to me, a very important novel called Sundiver by David Brin, which is the first book of the Uplift trilogy, which presents this idea of, what if intelligence actually first arose inside the sun? Like, what if that's where the progenitors of, life on Earth came from? And so playing with that idea of cultures existing within the sun where nobody can see them was just a fun trope that I could throw in there. And then a few years later, they did an entire, the Dawn of Flame adventure path is entirely about exploring the sun and mashing up those ideas of, the science fiction elements of the sun with stuff like the plane of fire in the City of Brass, because obviously, why wouldn't fire elementals feel totally at home on the sun, right?
Of course, yeah.
Trying to mix up those different flavors.
Yeah. All right, James. Do you? I think we're gonna pivot towards the world building session, if that's okay with you.
Sounds great. Let's do it.
Awesome. Okay, so the way that this is going to work is that we have a couple of categories that we're going to roll some random dice for, and we're going to build as we go. And then at a certain point, we're going to get to the part where we throw in a twist, and then we have to take the previously established thing that we have and then throw in the twist
and make it work, like they say.
Gotcha.
All right. So first things, well, before we get going, do you have a particular flavor that you want to focus on, or you just want to let the dice decide?
Let's let the dice decide.
Okay.
Right? It's all fantasy, right?
No. We've got the first die I'm going to roll is the type of flavor that we're going for, whether it be sci-fi, fantasy, horror, or modern day. So let's see.
All right, yeah, let's go for it.
All right. So first things first, we've got a 1, which brings it into sci-fi.
Sci-fi.
Okay.
Next up, we're going to go with the subject, and that's going to be either item, monster, place, historical figure, event, or roll twice and combine. So let's see what we get here.
Not roll twice, too much.
We've got event. Okay. And now we've got the theme, which is madness, sacrifice, love, metamorphosis, pride and honor, the unspeakable, triumph, and hope. So we're going to see what we get there. And we have, what's that, a 3?
Oh, love.
That's
Great.
love.
So sci-fi that features an event and involves a theme of love.
Yes.
All right. Shape of water.
Yeah. All right. So James, we're going to let you start off with, even if it's just a basic idea, we'll let you start off. So it's a sci-fi event that has a theme surrounding love. So go ahead.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, what if it's an alien race that is super long-lived, but they only mate every 1,000 years, and they all do it at the same time. And so the galactic civilization is kind of thrown into a weird tumult by the fact that for a year, this really powerful alien race that normally is in charge of a bunch of things, it's just one giant OK Cupid fueled dating
Ponfar. That's what I was trying to think of.
Yeah.
See, why does my brain go to the Zoidberg race when they all go?
That was totally a reference.
Yeah, exactly.
Ponfar, Zoidberg,
Why not pick Zoidberg?
Okay. All right. So more specifically, so we've got this ancient. So this is an event. How can we now twist the event to make it more not? Go ahead.
What if they've got to get together all the people of this ancient civilization for their love fest, but the rest of the galaxy is kind of not being paid mind to, because you said that this civilization is a big deal, right?
Yeah.
What if they're incredibly warlike, and this weird time of weakness of love is the time where people are like, "What the hell is going on?"
Yeah.
What?
Yeah.
Why have they
every
retreated?
1,000 years, there's a truce. And also, I kind of imagine these people kind of being disgusted that they have to take the year off to love, especially if they're going to be warlike.
Until they start feeling it.
Yeah.
Well, or what if there's even what if it's just synced up really terribly? What if in addition to being, this race, one of the reasons they're so important is because they're the ones who every so often have to push the button to keep the black hole that powers everything from devouring their world. But this year, pushing the button like coincides with the love, the love fest. So they either need to like stop this black hole from destroying the galaxy, or doing so would cause them to skip this mating thing and sort of doom their race. They're kind of caught between two disasters.
And they don't want it to be publicly known, because if it became known that this is when they're doing their mating ritual or whatever, people could take advantage of that and
sure,
of course. Now let's talk about a little bit more about a doomed race, because when I say event, do we want this to have already happened? Like, is this black hole singularity type event? Has this already happened? So now we're in the present. Now there's like very few of them, and there's like they're dying off maybe or something.
I like the idea of like they got to go to this thing and deal with it, but we're stuck with the consequences of not being here, because it seems like that's where the tension is.
They're purposely using the black hole and the time dilation to cause their species to get rebooted and just launch a bunch of children at the same time.
Okay.
Time dilation is a really interesting aspect of all of this, right? Like maybe they've used that time dilation to somehow like effectively make themselves immortal, because as they approach the black hole, time is stretching out, but they've somehow figured out a way to communicate out of it, and so that's how they manage to achieve this form of like near immortality while still affecting the rest of the universe.
You're essentially creating a paragon race just through like time manipulation in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, and one thing I would just one general idea I would throw out there. Something that I've learned over the years is while it depends on your setting, oftentimes putting the big interesting events in the past ends up kind of biting you, because people say, "Oh, that's super cool. Like I want to play through that. Like I want to experience that."
Yeah.
So
that was the feeling I had too. Like it was such an interesting concept. Like let's be in that moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. And like Fallen. Growing up in the ruins of a fallen empire is a really useful, interesting trope. But something I always encourage people to do is say, like, okay, when you've come up with an idea, like, explore both sort of the past of that idea and the future of that idea, and see if maybe the most interesting time might be at a different place than where you originally get it, right? Like, so, for instance, if you've got that flying city, is the most interesting time for that city like while it's being constructed, when it's first launching, like as it's being attacked at the height of its power, or like 20 years after it's been destroyed and now people are exploring the ruins of it, right? Like just sort of going forward and backward on the timeline can be really useful.
What a great piece of advice. Like that's really cool, because now you can kind of, I mean, one, it's tripling your work in a lot of ways, but it also makes sure that you get the best idea out of that core concept possible.
But it gives you the history of anything that you haven't used, so you can build off of that quickly.
Well, and it forces you not to dwell on backstory, because I feel like that's what happens in world building. We create too much backstory, but we're not dwelling in the moment of it,
Exactly.
Yeah. All right, so I feel like we've got a pretty good core concept down for this. Now let's fuck it up with some twists.
Please don't put family gets involved.
That would be great. Yeah.
Actually, yeah. So we've got a bunch of twists. I'm not going to say them all out loud. I'm just going to roll the die.
Just roll and tell us what we get. All right.
All right. So look at that, a 1. So everything is wrong.
Oh, so they're not actually going there to mate then, maybe.
Yeah.
So
So maybe what Chris said earlier about them rebooting, maybe it's a matter of they have some kind of weird cyclical event that happens to them, and this is not like really a love ritual at all.
It's their birth.
Oh, they're like witnessing their own birth all over again.
You mean like the death of their civilization and birth of it are simultaneously happening constantly?
Yeah. The death and the birth.
Yeah. And so they're like in sort of a recursive loop. Interesting.
And the black hole plays some role in that, I assume.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. You gotta imagine. Yeah. Okay.
Sci-fi black hole is kind of like a wizard did it.
It's the ultimate thing.
Yeah. Exactly.
Or somehow the aboliths are involved.
They're always involved.
Oh my God. I used to have So you talk about aboleths. I used to have on the wall of the editorial pit at Paizo, there was a whiteboard, and I just drew a flow chart that just said, did the aboleths do it? And like, if you got to yes, it said no, they didn't. Because it's too.
Too
there was
easy.
something. Yeah, there was some project where like a monster book where 3 of the 10 monsters in it were all, well, the aboleth made these, and it was like, nope, you're like, we used it all up. Nobody gets to play with the aboleth for a little while.
It's kind of like half dragons. Like eventually in third and 3.5 edition, there were so many half dragons and dragonlings, and like there was the Book of Draconic and stuff like that. That I remember, I can't remember who it was, but someone at Paizo was like, all right, we can't do dragons. We can't do half dragons anymore. We're just, the gap stops here.
And
like,
every race can't be ancient. You all can't be ancient. One of you was first.
Well, and it's interesting, like, it's a problem that shows up a lot because anytime you build something cool, the temptation is to go back to that well over and over again. And especially I find that's a problem with newer authors. And this can go either way because oftentimes when you're training up a new author or a new writer, they'll be tempted to either play with all the toys they already love about the setting, which leads to everybody trying to make everything about those couple of, big questions, or you'll have somebody who's trying to leave their mark on the world by doing whatever was popular before, but more, so it's like,
more
okay,
outrageous.
yeah, exactly. It's like, okay, well, you liked Aridin, now we've got Super Aridin, that kind of thing.
I lived through 90s Image comics. I know what you're talking about.
Right, yeah, like and so I feel like both of those are two symptoms of that same pull to play with what's already been established and cool. And I think you got to be really careful with that because often it's better to invent something sort of related but different.
Yeah. All right. So I think that's going to do it for the world building part. James, thanks so much for that. That was really fun.
That was incredibly effective, you guys. Like,
Yeah.
I feel like you've got a novel right there with
so easily
with that premise. Like that could easily be a classic science hard SF sort of book.
I'd read it.
Yeah, it's called Zoidberg: The Awakening.
Yes.
It becomes a comedy if you just believe it's Zoidberg involved.
You could totally turn it into like a treasure hunting thing while they're all doing their sex thing. There's a whole bunch of people like rampaging their planet. Who knows?
Oh yeah. All right, so James, I got some quick questions for you.
Yeah.
So I have some people. My wife wants to know: is cereal a soup?
Cereal is soup.
Yes.
Wow. I had never thought about it before, but it's gotta be.
Okay. What RPGs have you been playing recently?
Oh God. Not as many as I should. The last one I played was I actually ran a Starfinder game. I ran my convention game for a friend who was right about to have a kid as sort of the gamer baby shower equivalent, where it's
That's
like,
amazing.
okay, you're not gonna have a lot of time, so for tonight we're all like getting dressed up in costumes and we're running, just like a 3-hour one-shot game, and it was really fun.
That's I want that in my life. I want a friend like you in my life, so when my life ends by having a child, I can at least look back on the baby shower game.
Right.
All right, and so you were for those of you who might not know. James is also in a band called Brides of the Lizard God.
Yes.
And so in researching for the interview, I listened to the first album, and the first 5 seconds of the song just had a big, stupid smile plastered on my face.
Nice.
So obviously you're kind of a fan of like metal and like hardcore and punk.
Oh,
music.
yeah.
So can you list anything that you may have been able to put into world building as a result? And if not, just go ahead and tell me what you've been listening to.
Oh God, they came out of metal. Let's see. I would say a lot of Starfinder stuff has been fueled by Coheed and Cambria.
They got stuff I bent, don't they? Yeah.
They're my favorite sort of prog band. I really love their stuff. I'm trying to think. I've drawn a lot of maps while listening to a sort of smaller time hardcore band called It Prevails. Their subject matter isn't very science fiction, but I normally can't listen to a ton of music while I'm writing,
Same. Yeah.
which is why I really love, when I'm writing an adventure, there will come the point where I say, okay, well, now I got to spend like 2 days drawing maps for this thing. And that's when I get to just throw on like, all right, I'm going to listen to all my old, like hardcore and metal and all these different things, and just kind of blast it while I'm drawing tiny little boxes for, some city map. Let's see. What else have I been listening to a lot recently? I think actually this isn't metal at all. Like I have very eclectic tastes because I'll be like, I'll listen to some really hardcore metal stuff, and then like recently I've been listening to a lot of Bleachers. I don't know if you've ever heard that band, but it's sort of like poppy. It's one of the dudes from that band Fun, so he's super popular. But it's just this really fun, like 80s inspired, big kind of dancey rock stuff. And so I've been loving that. But just yesterday, I was slacking when I should have been writing and recording a bunch of like instrumental stuff in the vein of like Russian Circles, kind of instrumental metal. And actually, man. You know what? I will plug, because what inspired me to do that, I will plug another podcast that I really enjoy called Tomorrow We Die, which is all hardcore musicians from the Seattle area telling stories about being on tour. And it just cracks me up every time when somebody's like, well, and then we were in Minnesota and it got so cold that the door handles broke off the van and all our stuff was inside and we couldn't play. It's times like that, because I did get so into music in my 20s. I was really trying to make a go of it in like a hardcore band called Shadow at Morning. It's stories like that make me really thankful that I decided to pursue writing instead of music as my actual career, because it's so cool. Music is so cool and so miserable as a profession.
I feel like there's a reason that a lot of rock stars are super messed up. It's because that's what the industry does to you at that
Living
point.
On the road, man. Yeah. Like I feel so fortunate, and I talk about this with all my band friends. Like feel so fortunate that I've been able to work in RPGs and novels, which pay enough that I can actually afford to, live in a house and eat food that's not Taco Bell every day.
That's a big deal.
And also the fact that writing is something you can do on your downtime, like outside of having, a regular job. Like you can't have a regular day job and be on tour for 6 months, but you can totally come home from your job every night, and steal an hour to work on your novel or your game settings. So I feel like writing is one of the most freeing of the artistic pursuits for that reason.
Absolutely. And that is going to do it for like the quick round, unless you guys have any other questions. Anything quick?
No. Oh, I did have one question. It's kind of a more nerdy technical question.
Yeah.
So, okay, because you're a guy who has like had to handle so much information, whether it's managing like lots of people creating a campaign and doing the work for your own novels. Yeah. What software are you using to manage your notes, whether it's, paper or software, or what are you doing to deal with
that? So I will tell you the truth about Pathfinder and Starfinder is one of the things that was the best is for Pathfinder, a bunch of fans created this thing called the Pathfinder Wiki, where they were trying to just archive all of the world information we'd ever presented. And pretty much from day one, everybody in the office went, oh, thank God, because now we don't have to hold it in our heads. And we could search through all the PDFs and stuff, but it suddenly got so easy to just go to this Wikipedia of our game, so we used that constantly. And I think we actually hired one of Mark Moreland, who was one of the main developers over at Pathfinder, came straight out of that community of people who built that thing. Yeah. Step one, if you've got fans that'll do it for you, that's really awesome. I know a number of authors who have been lucky enough to have that, but the rest of the time, honestly, I'm pretty bad at keeping notes. Like I tend to keep them just in a giant wad at the end of the Word document, which is not the most convenient. But recently, an author named Tobias Buckel introduced me to this software called VoodooPad, which is basically
never heard of that.
It's like a build your own little wiki thing, but it's not online. It's just internal on your computer, and I've found that to be really interesting to try and build out, a world document where I can then link to. Okay, if I name the three gods here, I can click on their name, and it'll bring me to a new page where I can write stuff up about them, and
That's neat. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you call
Yeah, and I
it
think-
Pad.
Yeah, and it's free. That said, he told me about it. I played with it for like 2 days and then promptly got sucked into other projects. So I haven't used it on a full project, but
Gotcha.
that kind of wiki software seems great.
Yeah. And
Cool.
and speaking of plugs, I think we're just about at the end of our time here, James. So is there anything that you want to plug while we got the last 2 minutes?
Yeah, like your new novels.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't have any new novels to announce quite yet, unfortunately. Working on that. But in the meantime, I am the writer on a new Starfinder game for Amazon Alexa, which is sort of a new frontier for that brand and kind of for RPGs in general. But it's a voice game that you play through Alexa. Like, she sort of acts as your GM, and it's like a solo campaign. And the first episode of it is free and available now if anybody wants to play it. Like, if you have an Alexa device, you can literally just say Alexa, play Starfinder, and it'll launch you right into going around Apple's Station hunting goblins and stuff. So that's a big
really
project
cool.
I'm working on right now. But if anybody's interested, I'm always on Twitter at James L. Sutter. My website is jameslsutter.com. I also teach a lot of classes on world building and other elements of writing. So
I saw
if
that workshop
that's-
on your site. The one it's in Seattle, right? Is it?
There's a new one. Yeah, sometimes I do it online. I'm really fortunate. I got invited by Clarion West, who's sort of the premier science fiction author training program. Like, they do big programs in the summer that's like 6 weeks, but they also do one-day workshops. So they're having me do a day-long session where I basically just download every trick I've learned about world building over the course of 6 hours. Just kind of like, we'll all drink from the world building fire hose together. But it's really fun. I've taught that class a couple of times.
Yeah. All right. James, thank you so very much for joining us. It's been a real delight, and I don't often say that. Yeah.
I feel bad for your other guests now.
I'm constantly abused.
Yeah. But again, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. And thank you.
Thank you. This was so much fun, and I want to hear the novel you guys write about that black
Daniel
hole.
will get right on that. Yeah, absolutely. And I hope you enjoyed that interview with James L. Sutter. It was a real honor to be able to interview someone with that much experience and someone who's genuinely just a super nice and cool person.
And be able to create with him was kind of fun.
Yeah, that was a genuine highlight for me in general.
I hope he never realizes that, in a way, he gave us a free world building class.
Yes.
Oh, we definitely got some free. Although, to be fair, this is probably advertising for his world building class as well.
He has a
So
Clarion workshop, guys.
Yeah.
We're checking out.
honestly, I would strongly
go there.
recommend it. Like, just from the brief conversation that we had with him, he is like full to bursting of really, really interesting ideas and knowledge of the industry and everything.
In Grub Street, they have workshops like this, but what I really would like is having it like something like that here. Like, they don't have genre workshops.
Yeah, I think that's kind of important, especially if you're looking for specific genre work more than anything else. So yeah, that will just about do it. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed our interview with James L. Sutter, and you can look forward to more interviews, not necessarily with James, but in the future. We have a couple that are hopefully kind of coalescing as we speak, and we're going to be doing more of these episodes in the future. If you think that's a bad idea, or if you want to tell us who you think we should interview, you can go ahead and shoot us an email at worldbuildwithus@gmail.com. Or we've recently been really stepping up our footprint on Twitter. You can follow us on Twitter at Let's Worldbuild, and you can basically direct message us, and or tweet directly at us, and we'll get back to you pretty quickly. And until next time, just remember that we love you very much, and I hope you have a good week.